Hi, good evening. So today I would like to talk about a certain kind of whale. Actually, many marine creatures also, but I'll specify about this particular whale that has this ability to survive in in deep seas of oceans without having a functioning lungs, or even when the lungs cease to function, it's able to survive in a particular window of 45 minutes. Sorry, it's shaking. Yeah. I will talk about this characteristic in this video, and it is a certain kind of a whale which has a certain oily, oily bag-like object inside its head, and because of that, it's called a sperm whale, and there is a certain history to that. So in this video, I will talk about the this particular ability of the sperm whale to survive in deep waters, not only survive but also to capture its prey and consume it in deep waters without having without having lungs that function, or when the lungs cease to function in deep waters. So the video will go like this. Firstly, I will tell why the lungs cease to function. It's not that sperm whales don't have lungs. Sperm whales have lungs, but in deep waters they cease to function. I will talk about why they cease to function. And then after they cease to function, how is it that a whale, without having oxygen in its, without having a movement of oxygen from its lungs to the bloodstream, it's still able to carry out its survival mechanism. It's still able to have those swimming muscles functioning, and can also just survive, and not only that, but attack its prey called another creature which has tentacles and which has a long beak, which is rubbery monster. It's called a giant squid. It's able to spot out this giant squid using a mechanism in its head. I told you that it has a oily sac in its head, and it's able to focus sound using this oily sac, and it's also a reason why it's called a sperm whale, and there's a history to that. So it's able to focus sound in this oily sac. It's able to produce certain clicks that echo back to it after hitting an object or its prey, and it's able to spot out its prey. It's able to do all these things without a functioning lung, without functioning lungs. So, firstly, let me just start off by telling you why the lungs cease to function in deep waters for a sperm whale. Firstly, I would like you to imagine a sperm whale that is at the surface of the ocean, the surface of a sea. At this point, the exterior of the sperm whale receives uh, or gets or is under the pressure of the atmosphere, is able to experience the atmospheric pressure. And now the lungs are functioning quite well at the surface of the deep seas or oceans, or rather just seas, not deep seas. The lungs are quite inflated, and the pressure inside the lungs are same as the atmospheric pressure. That way the lungs are able to stay intact without collapsing under the pressure of the atmospheric pressure. Only when the pressure within is same as the pressure without is there going to be equilibrium of that lungs. So now I would like you to imagine the whale descending deeper and deeper into the ocean. After 1 meter, the whale not only has a pressure of atmosphere on it, external to it, but also the column of water, the one column of water below which it has descended. The gases within the lungs, predominantly oxygen, nitrogen, and other small gases, are pushing back on this extra pressure. Basically, the pressure of these gases should increase compared to what they were, when the whale was at the surface. So the pressure, so that the pressure within is same as the pressure without, so that the pressure without here is also a pressure that one gets after adding that extra column of 1 meter, let us say 1 meter of water, in addition to the atmospheric pressure. So to be able to increase the pressure of gases within the lungs would have to shrink. The volume of the lungs would have to come down. They have to decrease. Only then would the pressure of gases, that is predominantly nitrogen and oxygen within the lungs, increase and become equal to that of the pressure without, or the exterior, or the pressure external to the whale. So after 10 meters, the situation of pressure within the lungs, the volume of the lungs is like this. The pressure within the lungs of the gases, oxygen and nitrogen, is twice that of what it is when the whale was near the surface of the ocean. And that had happened because the lungs had shrunk a little bit. The volume of lungs had come down to half what they were at the surface. I would like to talk about one lung, so half what it was at the surface. So that's the situation of volume and pressure after 10 meters, after the whale had descended 10 meters. Now let us go a little deeper. Let us say the whale had gone down to around 1 kilometer. At this time, the pressure within the lungs become 100 times what it was at the surface. Not only that, you can imagine what will happen to the volume. So volume had come down and it had become 1% of what it was, volume of the lungs, of what it was at the surface. So ultimately, because of the increase of this pressure within the lungs, there are certain things that are happening with respect to the gases within the lungs. Firstly, the gases are naturally hitting very hard among themselves, and also with the walls of the interior walls of the lungs. Yeah, it's shaking a little. Yeah, and not only that, the molecules, the oxygen, the nitrogen, also collide with each other more often than they did when the whale was at the surface. In addition to that, there are more number of molecules that are hitting the interior walls of the lungs than before, than when the whale was at the surface. And the fourth thing is the velocity, the speed of the molecules with which they're hitting each other and the walls of the lungs also increases. So you can imagine at 1 kilometer below the surface, or within the water, when the whale has descended by 1 kilometer within the water, the pressure was 100 times what it was when the whale was at the surface. Now this has certain consequences. Now in the lungs, the gases just don't stay. The purpose of the gases in the lungs, not the purpose, the gases just don't stay. There is an exchange of gases between the bloodstream and those within the lungs, and this happens through certain delicate structures in the lungs called alveoli. If the whale was at the surface, this exchange would occur, and there'll be quite a few molecules that would enter quite a few molecules of oxygen and nitrogen that would enter the bloodstream. But when the whale has descended to 1 kilometer below the sea level, the oxygen and nitrogen once again enter the bloodstream, but there are more number of oxygen and nitrogen molecules than there were when the whale was at the surface, and I told you the reason why, because the pressure is increased. Because more number of nitrogen and oxygen molecules enter the bloodstream, there are some fatal consequences to the whale, especially with regard to nitrogen. And let me tell you what happens when the nitrogen enters the bloodstream of the whale. What fatal consequence does the whale have? So, what I would like to say here is, now the whale is 1 kilometer below the surface. Imagine that the whale abruptly tries to ascend to the surface of 1 kilometer below the sea level. Now let us say the whale abruptly tries to move to the surface of the ocean. Now once again there is a change in the dynamics of pressure. The pressure within has to be same as the pressure without. The pressure without has decreased because the whale has ascended and it's coming close to the surface of the sea. So there is a decrease in pressure, and then there is also an increase in volume. And not only that, there is an abrupt decrease in pressure as the whale abruptly moves to the surface. So initially, when the whale had been 1 kilometer below the surface, there were these large number of nitrogen molecules that were pressed into the bloodstream and they dissolved into the bloodstream. Oxygen also binds to the blood, but then oxygen gets used up. Nitrogen just directly gets dissolved and it stays inert inside the bloodstream. It is soluble and it becomes quite soluble because it's been pressed into the bloodstream with high pressure below 1 meter below the surface of the sea. Now suddenly if the pressure comes down, suddenly if the pressure of nitrogen gas comes down within the lungs due to the abrupt rise of the whale towards the open seas or the surface of the sea, the nitrogen that is dissolved in the blood also loses pressure and it tries to separate from the blood. The manifestation of this is that the nitrogen gas originates as bubbles from the bloodstream. And because the nitrogen gas now originates as bubbles, it could restrict the flow of blood, the blood that consists of oxygen, that carries oxygen to tissues. The tissues would get damaged. Not only that, it's also obstructing the blood flow and could also break or damage the blood vessels. All these are fatal to the whale. So if increase in the pressure of the lungs inside the lungs is fatal at a position 1 kilometer below the sea level, is there a way that was found out so that the whale still survives? And there is a way. The evolutionary mechanism had found a way. The evolutionary mechanism had found a way. Just go back and think back. I told you, the lungs ceased to function. And that's what the evolutionary mechanism has found out. But then if the lungs cease to function, how is it that the oxygen enters the bloodstream? Evolutionary mechanism had also found another way to compensate for that. There is another way out of that problem. And the way out for that problem is the hemoglobin that binds oxygen, just like in humans, is twice that of the humans in the sperm whale. And therefore there's more oxygen that gets that's binded to hemoglobin, and therefore that oxygen could be used when the whale is at deep seas. Not only that, there is another protein. So basically hemoglobin is a protein that is in the blood vessels that gives red color to the blood and binds oxygen. There is another protein that also gives red color to the tissue that it occupies, and it is called myoglobin, and it is in muscle tissues, and you can see why the muscles are red. So this tissue myoglobin, the quantity of this tissue myoglobin is 10 times that of humans in the sperm whale. So therefore, this also binds to oxygen just like hemoglobin does. No, rather it binds oxygen to it. Oxygen enters it and comes to it, and it binds oxygen to it. So you can imagine that not only does hemoglobin have high capacity to carry oxygen compared to humans, there is also a storage mechanism in muscles in the form of the protein called myoglobin that stores oxygen, that reserves oxygen, so that it could be used when it's needed. So when is it needed? It's needed in the deep seas when lungs stop to function. But the problem here is there's a small problem. It can't supply oxygen forever. The hemoglobin can't supply oxygen forever. The myoglobin cannot supply oxygen forever. It can only supply as much as it stores with it. So there is a 45-minute window within which the sperm whale has to complete its survival, has to search for its prey and consume it before it comes back to the surface to replenish the amount of oxygen that is reserved, that has to be reserved within myoglobin, that has to be taken and that had to be bound to the hemoglobin. So basically, I told you so far in this video that it is quite fatal for a whale to sustain such high pressure within its lungs in deep oceans and carry out the mechanism of blood supply, of supply of gases to the bloodstream. And the way out for it is the storage of reserves of oxygen in certain proteins. So the whale survives in those 45 minutes and then comes back to the surface. And at the surface, once again, the lungs start to function, the lungs start to reinflate, the lungs start to supply oxygen to the bloodstream. In effect, the lungs get reconnected to the bloodstream, and then the oxygen is once again reserved. So I would like to tell you one more point. The lungs cease to function as soon as the whale leaves the surface. I told you the whale leaves the surface at some point and the lungs cease to function. And then whale starts to once again replenish it once it comes back to the surface. So the entire point of this video is to talk about two things. One thing is to divert the consciousness of the viewer to the fact that a pressure difference between the gases in the lungs and the gases outside the whale causes a shrinkage of volume of lungs, has an effect on the volume of lungs, causes a shrinkage in the volume of lungs when the whale descends into deeper oceans. And this shrinkage in the volume of lungs happens to ensure that the lung withstands the increased pressure external to it when the whale starts to descend down into deep oceans. For that, the pressure within the lungs has to increase, and therefore the volume decreases. So I also talked about what it means for an increase of pressure within the lungs. Predominantly, it means that the number of molecules that hit a certain area within the lungs increase, and there are the average speed of the molecules increase, the collision of the molecules increase and become quite frequent than when they were at the surface, when the whale was at the surface. And most importantly, they hit hard against the walls of the lungs, interior walls of the lungs, or the interior of the lungs. The second aspect was to talk about the entire mechanism as to how the whale could survive without the functioning of lungs in the deep oceans. And I talked about the mechanism as well. Therefore, I end this video with these two conclusions. I hope you found this video interesting. Thank you very much.